The bread came out of the Dutch oven with a golden crust and a rise that defied everything the neighboring settlers knew about baking in winter. Inside Elias Brennan's cabin, where frost coated the interior walls most mornings, the loaves were light, airy, and impossible. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom speak to you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale involves an innovation so simple it sounds like fiction. The winter of 1841 brought cold to the Ohio frontier that killed livestock in their barns and froze water buckets solid within an hour of drawing from the well. Elias Brennan stood in his cabin on a January morning, staring at a loaf of bread that should not exist. The crust was golden brown. The interior showed an even crumb structure with air pockets distributed throughout. When he tore a piece away, steam rose from the soft interior. The bread had risen perfectly, despite the fact that the cabin's interior temperature hovered somewhere near freezing. His wife Margaret had baked it 3 days before she died. She had used their last portion of flour, their last bit of lard, and something else Elias had not identified at the time. He had been checking their trap lines when she baked. When he returned that evening, the bread sat cooling on their table, and Margaret was in bed with the fever that would kill her within 48 hours. Elias was 34 years old. He had married Margaret 6 years earlier in Pennsylvania before they made the journey west to claim land under the preemption laws. They had built their cabin, cleared 3 acres, planted crops, and survived their first 5 winters through careful planning and hard work. Margaret had been strong, capable, and practical. The fever came suddenly. One day she was fine. The next she complained of chills. By the 3rd day she was delirious. On the 4th day she died. The local community helped Elias bury her on a hillside overlooking their property. 17 settlers attended the brief ceremony. The ground was frozen solid. They had to build fires on the burial site for 2 days to thaw the earth enough to dig. Elias thanked them and returned to his empty cabin. He sat alone for 3 days, unable to work, unable to sleep properly, unable to do much beyond feed the fire and stare at nothing. On the 4th day after Margaret's death, he noticed the bread still sitting on the shelf where he had placed it. In the cold cabin, it had not molded. He broke off a piece and ate it, and the taste brought back a flood of memories that nearly broke him. But the taste also brought a question. How had Margaret made bread rise in a cabin this cold? Elias knew the basics of bread making: flour, water, salt, lard or butter, and yeast. The yeast required warmth to activate. Every frontier woman knew that bread dough needed to be kept warm, usually near a fire, covered with cloth, left to rise for hours. In a cabin as cold as theirs had been that week, yeast would not activate. The dough would remain dense and flat. Yet Margaret's bread had risen beautifully. Elias examined the remaining loaf carefully. He smelled it. He studied the crumb structure. He tried to remember anything unusual about that day, any detail that might explain what she had done differently. He found nothing, but the question lodged in his mind and would not leave. Elias spent the next week trying to reconstruct what Margaret might have done. He went through their supplies methodically, taking inventory of everything in the cabin. They had no yeast remaining. Margaret had used the last of it weeks earlier, and Elias had not yet made the 3-day journey to the nearest settlement with a trading post to purchase more. This fact made the bread even more inexplicable. Without yeast, there should have been no rise at all. He examined their food stores. A small amount of corn meal remained in a cloth sack, a partial container of salt, some dried beans, a bit of lard in a crock. The flour was gone. Margaret had used it all for that final baking. He found nothing that suggested an alternative leavening agent. Elias was not an educated man. He had learned to read and write at a basic level from his father, but his schooling had ended at age 12 when he began working full-time on the family farm. His knowledge of chemistry or baking science was non-existent. What he did have was practical intelligence and the ability to observe carefully. He began visiting neighboring cabins, asking the women about their bread-making methods. This was unusual behavior for a man, especially a grieving widower, and it raised eyebrows. He spoke with Anna Peterson, a widow who lived 2 miles north. She explained her process: flour, water, salt, a bit of lard, and yeast starter that she kept alive by feeding it regularly. She kept her dough near the fire, covered with a cloth, for 3 to 4 hours until it doubled in size. He visited the Kern family cabin. Thomas Kern's wife, Elizabeth, described an identical process. Every woman he spoke with used the same basic method. Warmth and time were essential. Without both, bread would not rise. Several women mentioned that during the coldest winter weeks, they sometimes struggled to get bread to rise properly, even when keeping the dough as close to the fire as possible. Elias returned home with no answers. He sat in his cabin and tried to think like Margaret. She had been resourceful, always finding ways to stretch supplies or substitute ingredients when necessary. If she had run out of yeast and discovered an alternative method, she would have used it without fanfare. He remembered something his mother had mentioned years ago about old-fashioned methods used before commercial yeast was available. Starters made from potatoes, sourdough cultures that required days of careful maintenance. But none of these explained Margaret's bread. Elias decided to attempt baking bread himself. He rode 3 days to the trading post and purchased flour, more lard, and a small portion of commercial yeast. The cost depleted his limited cash reserves, but he needed answers. Back at the cabin, he attempted to follow the instructions the women had given him. He mixed flour with water, added salt and lard, crumbled in the yeast. He placed the bowl near the fire and waited. After 4 hours, the dough had barely changed. The cabin was simply too cold. He gave up and baked it anyway. The resulting bread was dense, heavy, and barely edible. Margaret had somehow made perfect bread in these exact conditions. The answer existed. He simply could not see it yet. Elias woke on a February morning to find his water bucket frozen solid and frost patterns coating the inside of his window. He built up the fire and began his morning routine, which now included examining every aspect of his cabin for clues about Margaret's baking. He had become obsessed with the question, unable to focus on normal tasks without his mind returning to the impossible bread. He was cleaning out the fireplace, shoveling ash into a bucket to carry outside, when he noticed something odd. Near the hearth, partially hidden behind the wood box, sat a small wooden bowl containing fine gray powder. Elias picked it up and examined it. The powder was ash, but it had been sifted. Someone had taken regular wood ash and strained it through cloth to remove chunks and debris, leaving only the finest particles. Margaret had done this. Elias recognized the bowl as one she used for kitchen preparations. But why would she sift ash? Ash was waste, swept out and scattered in the garden or along paths to provide traction on ice. Nobody stored refined ash in kitchen bowls. Elias set the bowl on the table and stared at it. A memory surfaced, something his grandmother had mentioned when he was young. She had talked about old methods, techniques from before modern conveniences, something about ash and soap making, ash and lye. His grandmother had made her own soap using water filtered through wood ash to extract lye, which was then combined with animal fat. Lye was caustic, dangerous if handled improperly. But it was also alkaline. Elias did not know chemistry, but he knew that lye reacted with certain substances. Could ash react with bread dough? Could it cause rising through some process different from yeast? He had no way to test the theory safely. Using lye in food seemed dangerous, possibly poisonous. But Margaret had made bread that he had eaten without illness. If she had used ash, it must be safe somehow. Perhaps the heat of baking neutralized any harmful properties. Perhaps only certain types of ash were safe. Perhaps the amount mattered critically. Elias decided to research carefully before experimenting. He rode to visit Jonas Whitmore, a traveling preacher who passed through the region several times each year. Whitmore was educated, had attended seminary, and owned several books. If anyone might know about historical baking methods or the properties of wood ash, it would be him. He found Whitmore staying with a family 15 miles south. The preacher listened to Elias's questions with interest. He admitted knowing little about baking, but mentioned that ancient peoples had used various alkalis in food preparation. He loaned Elias a book on household chemistry, published 20 years earlier, that discussed practical applications of common substances. Elias returned home and spent 3 days reading by firelight. His reading skill was limited, and the technical language challenged him, but he persisted. On the 4th day, he found a passage describing potash, a substance derived from wood ash that had been used historically in baking, soap-making, and glass production. The text mentioned that potash could create rising in certain baked goods through reaction with acidic ingredients. Elias closed the book and looked at the bowl of sifted ash Margaret had left behind. She had known something, discovered something, or remembered something that let her make bread rise without yeast in a freezing cabin. And the answer involved the ash from their own fireplace. Elias began his experiments in early March of 1842. He approached the process with caution, treating the ash as potentially dangerous until he understood it better. He started by replicating what he believed Margaret had done. He collected ash from hardwood fires, specifically ash from oak and maple, avoiding pine or other resinous woods. He sifted the ash through increasingly fine cloth until he had a powder that felt almost silky. The book Whitmore had loaned him mentioned that potash dissolved in water. Elias mixed a small amount of his refined ash with water in a tin cup. The mixture turned cloudy gray. He let it settle overnight. By morning, heavier particles had sunk to the bottom, leaving clearer liquid above. He carefully poured off this liquid, which the book called lye water, though it was much weaker than the concentrated lye used for soap. Testing it on food seemed reckless. Instead, Elias tested it on his skin first, diluting it heavily and touching it to his forearm. It tingled slightly but caused no burning or injury. Encouraged but still cautious, he decided to use a very small amount in an experimental baking. He mixed flour with water, added salt and lard, then added 1 teaspoon of his ash water. He also added a splash of buttermilk, remembering the book's mention of acid being necessary for the reaction. The dough felt different from yeast dough, slightly slicker. He shaped it into a small loaf and placed it directly in his Dutch oven over coals. The bread baked in 40 minutes. When Elias opened the Dutch oven, he found a loaf that had risen noticeably. Not as much as perfect yeast bread, but far more than his previous attempts. The crust was golden. The interior showed actual air pockets. He let it cool, then tasted a small piece cautiously. It was edible. More than edible, it was good. The texture was lighter than he had managed with yeast in the cold cabin. There was a slight taste difference, not unpleasant, almost imperceptible. Elias ate half the small loaf that day and suffered no ill effects. Over the next 2 weeks, he repeated the experiment with variations. He tried different amounts of ash water. He tried adding vinegar instead of buttermilk. He experimented with letting the dough rest versus baking immediately. He discovered that the ash water needed acid to work properly. Buttermilk worked best, but vinegar or even slightly sour regular milk also functioned. The rising happened quickly, within minutes of mixing, not hours like yeast. This meant the dough could be mixed and baked immediately, requiring no warming time. The implications stunned him. This method eliminated the primary challenge of winter baking: no waiting for yeast to activate, no maintaining warmth for hours. Mix the ingredients, add ash water and acid, bake immediately. Total time from starting to finished bread was under an hour. Elias realized Margaret had discovered or remembered this technique and used it that final day. She had solved a problem that plagued every frontier household every winter, and she had done it using a waste product that every cabin produced daily. Elias's first mistake was mentioning his discovery too soon. In late March, he visited Thomas Kern's cabin to borrow a saw and mentioned his bread-making experiments. Thomas listened with polite skepticism, then called his wife Elizabeth to hear the explanation. Elias described the ash water method, the buttermilk, the quick rising and immediate baking. Elizabeth's expression shifted from curiosity to dismissal within seconds. She had been baking bread for 20 years, learned from her mother who had learned from her mother. The idea that ash, literal fireplace waste, could replace yeast struck her as nonsense. She said so directly. Ash was dirty, caustic, dangerous. Putting it in food was foolish at best, poisonous at worst. Thomas was gentler but equally doubtful. He suggested that Elias was perhaps confused in his grief, seeing patterns that did not exist. Maybe Margaret's final bread had not risen as well as Elias remembered. Memory could be unreliable, especially when emotion was involved. Elias offered to demonstrate. Elizabeth declined, saying she had bread to make using proper methods. The conversation ended awkwardly. Elias left with the borrowed saw and a clear understanding that his innovation would face resistance. He encountered similar reactions at other cabins. Anna Peterson listened with more openness, but ultimately doubted that ash could be safe for consumption. Henry Dalton, who operated a small mill 3 miles east, laughed outright at the idea. Dalton pointed out that people had been making bread for thousands of years. If ash worked as a leavening agent, everyone would already know about it. This argument troubled Elias until he realized its flaw. People did know about it, or had known. The book from Jonas Whitmore mentioned potash being used historically. Margaret had known somehow. The knowledge existed, but had been forgotten or displaced by commercial yeast. Frontier settlers used methods taught by their mothers, who used methods taught by their mothers. Innovation was rare because tradition was safe. Elias stopped trying to convince people and focused on refining his technique. He experimented with different wood types and discovered that hardwood ash worked better than softwood. Oak produced the most reliable results. Ash from pine or cedar created off flavors and seemed less effective. He tested various acids. Buttermilk remained the best option, producing excellent rise and pleasant flavor. Vinegar worked but required careful measurement to avoid sour taste. Sour milk worked adequately. He even tried using slightly fermented apple cider with decent results. The ratio mattered critically. Too much ash water made the bread taste soapy and created an unpleasant texture. Too little produced inadequate rise. Through dozens of trials, Elias determined that 1 teaspoon of refined ash water per cup of flour, combined with 2 tablespoons of buttermilk, produced optimal results. He documented nothing in writing. His literacy was limited, and recording measurements precisely was beyond his skill. But he practiced until the process became automatic, until he could judge by feel and appearance whether the dough had the right consistency. By April, Elias could produce consistently excellent bread in his freezing cabin in under an hour from start to finish. He had solved the problem completely. Now he needed someone to witness it. Jonas Whitmore returned to the area in mid-April during his regular circuit of frontier settlements. Elias sought him out immediately, finding the preacher at the Peterson cabin where he was conducting a small service. After the gathering, Elias asked Whitmore to visit his cabin to witness something important. The preacher agreed, curious about what Elias had learned from the borrowed book. They rode together to Elias's property. Inside the cabin, Elias had prepared his materials. A bowl of refined ash, a container of ash water he had prepared the previous day, flour, salt, lard, and buttermilk. His Dutch oven sat ready near the fire. Whitmore watched with interest as Elias explained what he was about to demonstrate. Elias measured flour into a wooden bowl, 2 cups. He added half a teaspoon of salt, a tablespoon of lard. He poured in 3/4 of a cup of water and began mixing. The dough came together quickly. Then he added 2 teaspoons of ash water and 4 tablespoons of buttermilk. He mixed thoroughly. Within seconds, tiny bubbles began appearing in the dough. Whitmore leaned closer, watching the reaction. The dough visibly expanded, growing lighter and airier as Elias kneaded it briefly. The entire mixing process took less than 5 minutes. Elias shaped the dough into a round loaf and placed it in the Dutch oven. He settled the oven into the coals of his fireplace and heaped more coals on the lid. Then he turned to Whitmore and said they would have fresh bread in 45 minutes. They sat and talked while the bread baked. Whitmore asked detailed questions about how Elias had developed the process, what experiments had failed, what ratios produced the best results. Elias explained everything he had learned over the past 2 months. The preacher listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification on technical details. When 45 minutes had passed, Elias pulled the Dutch oven from the coals. He lifted the lid, releasing a wave of steam and the smell of fresh bread. Inside sat a golden loaf with a properly risen dome. Elias turned it out onto his table and cut it open while still hot. The interior showed an even crumb structure with good air distribution throughout. Whitmore examined a slice carefully, smelling it, studying the texture. Then he tasted it. His expression shifted from cautious to surprised. He took another bite, chewing slowly. Finally, he looked at Elias and said the bread was excellent. Better than merely edible. Better than acceptable. It was genuinely good bread, and the fact that it had been made without yeast in a cabin this cold was remarkable. Elias felt vindication wash over him. Someone educated, someone respected in the community, had witnessed his method and confirmed it worked. Whitmore asked if he could borrow Elias's refined ash and try making bread himself at his next stop. Elias agreed immediately, providing a small container of ash water and detailed verbal instructions. The preacher left the next morning with Elias's materials and a promise to report his results. Word would spread now, not through Elias's unconvincing claims, but through Whitmore's credible testimony. The spring of 1842 remained unusually cold throughout April and into May. Frost continued killing early plantings, and cabin temperatures stayed brutally low even during daylight hours. The extended cold created a crisis for frontier families who depended on bread as a dietary staple. Yeast would not activate reliably, and women struggled to produce risen bread despite their best efforts. Jonas Whitmore carried Elias's ash water method to his next stops. At each cabin he demonstrated the technique personally, mixing dough and baking bread while families watched. The results were consistent: quick rising, reliable baking, good texture and flavor. Several women attempted the method themselves under Whitmore's guidance. Most succeeded after 1 or 2 tries. Anna Peterson was among the first converts. As a widow managing her household alone, she appreciated any technique that saved time and resources. She had been burning excessive firewood, trying to keep her cabin warm enough for yeast bread. Elias's method eliminated that waste entirely. She began using ash water exclusively for her baking and reported to neighbors that the technique worked exactly as Whitmore had demonstrated. Thomas Kern's wife, Elizabeth, remained skeptical until necessity forced her hand. In early May, their yeast starter died. Elizabeth had maintained the starter for 3 years, feeding it regularly and keeping it alive through careful management. But a particularly cold night killed it despite her precautions. Without starter and without means to travel to the trading post for commercial yeast, Elizabeth faced the prospect of feeding her family flatbread for weeks. Thomas suggested she try Elias's ash method. Elizabeth refused initially, still convinced that using ash in food was dangerous or unclean. But after 2 days of complaints from her children about dense, heavy bread, she relented. Thomas rode to Elias's cabin and asked for instruction. Elias provided refined ash, demonstrated the preparation of ash water, and explained the ratios carefully. Thomas returned home with materials and knowledge. Elizabeth followed the instructions precisely, though with obvious reluctance. Her first loaf came from the oven with excellent rise and golden crust. Her children ate it enthusiastically, noticing no difference from her regular bread. Elizabeth admitted, grudgingly, that the method worked. Word spread rapidly after that. When Elizabeth Kern, known throughout the area as an exceptional baker and traditionalist, endorsed the ash technique, other women paid attention. By late May, 7 families within a 10-mile radius were using ash water for bread making. The method proved particularly valuable for families with limited resources. Yeast cost money. Maintaining a starter required careful attention and some waste of flour during feeding. Ash was free and abundant. Every family burned wood daily for heat and cooking. Collecting and refining ash added minimal work to existing routines. Henry Dalton, the miller who had mocked Elias's idea months earlier, noticed the shift when women stopped asking about yeast availability. He inquired and learned about the ash method spreading through the community. Dalton visited Elias personally, apologized for his earlier dismissal, and asked for detailed instruction. Elias provided it without complaint or criticism. By June, when temperatures finally warmed enough for regular yeast baking to resume, most families continued using ash water anyway. The technique was simply more convenient. Faster preparation, no waiting for dough to rise, less firewood consumed, and results that matched or exceeded yeast bread quality. The ash water method spread through the frontier community without formal instruction or written documentation. Women taught neighbors. Neighbors taught relatives. Families moving through the area learned the technique and carried it to new settlements. By autumn of 1842, the method had reached communities 30 miles, in every direction from Elias's original cabin. The technique evolved as it spread. Some women discovered that using apple cider vinegar instead of buttermilk produced bread with longer shelf life. Others found that adding a small amount of honey improved flavor and browning. A few experimented with different ash sources and reported that cherry wood ash created slightly sweeter bread, while hickory produced a more neutral taste. These variations were shared freely. Frontier life rewarded practical knowledge and punished secrecy. A woman who discovered an improvement to the ash method would demonstrate it to her neighbors without hesitation. The collective refinement made the technique increasingly reliable and adaptable to different circumstances. Elias watched this process with quiet satisfaction. He made no effort to claim credit or control how the method developed. When people asked where the technique originated, he mentioned Margaret, saying she had either discovered or remembered it before her death. He positioned himself as merely the person who had figured out what she had done. This humility served him well. Frontier communities respected competence but distrusted self-promotion. By crediting Margaret and sharing his knowledge freely, Elias earned respect without creating resentment. Men began consulting him on other matters, asking his opinion on construction techniques or trap placement. Women sent their husbands to learn the ash preparation process directly from Elias, trusting his instruction over second-hand information. By winter of 1842, Elias noticed that new cabins in the area included better ash storage systems. Families built small boxes near their fireplaces specifically for collecting ash intended for baking. Keeping it separate from ash meant for disposal. Some households designated specific wood for burning when they needed baking ash, preferring oak or maple, and avoiding resinous woods entirely. The technique reached beyond immediate survival needs. Women began experimenting with ash water in other baked goods. Biscuits made with ash water rose beautifully and baked quickly. Certain types of cake benefited from the quick chemical leavening. Pancakes made with a small amount of ash water were lighter and fluffier than traditional versions. Henry Dalton incorporated the method into his mill operations. He began selling refined ash alongside flour, having discovered that many families preferred purchasing pre-prepared ash rather than refining it themselves. The ash sold for a few cents per pound, far less than commercial yeast, and Dalton reported steady demand throughout the cold months. Jonas Whitmore documented the spread of the technique in letters to other ministers in his circuit. He described it as an example of frontier innovation driven by necessity and refined through community cooperation. His letters reached settlements in Indiana and Illinois, carrying the method even further from its origin point. Elias continued his normal life, trapping, maintaining his property, and slowly recovering from Margaret's death. He baked bread regularly using the method she had left behind, each loaf a reminder of her resourcefulness and practical wisdom. Elias Brennan remarried in 1844. Her name was Catherine, a widow from Pennsylvania who had lost her husband to pneumonia the previous winter. They met through Jonas Whitmore's introduction and married after a brief courtship. Catherine already knew the ashwater method, having learned it from a neighbor who had learned it from a traveling family. She did not know that Elias had any connection to the technique until weeks after their wedding. When she discovered the truth, Catherine asked why Elias never mentioned his role. He replied simply that Margaret had done the important part. He had merely figured out what she had already known. Catherine accepted this explanation and never pressed further. They built a life together, raised 3 children, and prospered modestly through careful management and hard work. The ash water method became standard practice throughout Ohio frontier settlements by 1846. New arrivals learned it as part of basic homesteading instruction, taught alongside cabin building and food preservation. The technique's origin faded from common knowledge. Most people assumed it was traditional wisdom passed down through generations, not innovation developed within their own community's recent history. Elias rarely discussed the method's history, even when directly asked. He was 52 years old in 1854 when a young reporter from Cincinnati visited the area, gathering stories about frontier life. The reporter heard references to ash bread and ash water baking, inquired about its origins, and was eventually directed to Elias as someone who might know the history. Elias granted a brief interview. He explained that his first wife had used the method before her death in 1841, that he had reconstructed her technique through experimentation, and that Jonas Whitmore had helped spread the knowledge. The reporter took notes, thanked Elias, and left. The story never appeared in any publication that Elias saw. By 1860, commercial baking powder had become widely available through trading posts and general stores. The product offered similar, quick-rising properties to ash water, but with more consistent results and no preparation required. Gradually, frontier families shifted to baking powder for everyday use. Ash water remained a backup method, something people knew about and used when commercial products were unavailable. Elias died in 1868 at age 62 from complications following a fall from his barn roof. Catherine and their children buried him next to Margaret on the hillside overlooking the property he had claimed 27 years earlier. 17 neighbors attended the funeral. Several mentioned that Elias had been a good man, helpful and honest. None mentioned bread or ash, water or innovation. The technique persisted long after Elias's death. Remote homesteads continued using ash water into the 1880s, particularly in areas where access to stores was limited. Some families maintained the practice simply because it worked, and they saw no reason to change. The method appeared occasionally in handwritten recipe collections, usually without attribution or explanation of origin. By 1900, ash water baking had largely disappeared from common practice, replaced entirely by commercial baking powder and readily available yeast. The technique survived only in scattered family traditions and vague historical references to frontier resourcefulness. Modern historians researching frontier foodways occasionally encounter references to ash water baking in 19th century documents. Letters mention it casually. A few handwritten recipe collections include instructions without explanation. Census records from Ohio settlements in the 1840s note unusually low purchases of commercial yeast despite growing populations, suggesting alternative leavening methods were common. The chemistry behind the technique is straightforward. Wood ash contains potassium carbonate, an alkaline compound. When dissolved in water, and combined with acidic ingredients like buttermilk or vinegar, it produces carbon dioxide gas through a simple acid-base reaction. The gas creates bubbles in dough, causing it to rise. Heat from baking sets the structure before the gas escapes, resulting in light, airy bread. This chemical leavening process is identical to how modern baking powder works. Commercial baking powder simply packages the alkali and acid together in measured, stable form. Frontier settlers using ash water were performing the same chemistry using materials they produced themselves as byproducts of daily life. The innovation's significance lay not in its chemical novelty, but in its practical application. Someone, likely Margaret Brennan, recognized that a waste product could solve a critical survival problem. She either discovered the technique through experimentation or remembered it from older traditions and adapted it to frontier circumstances. Elias reconstructed and refined her method, then shared it freely with his community. The technique saved lives, though documenting specific instances is impossible. Bread provided essential calories and nutrition during brutal frontier winters. Families that could produce quality bread reliably had better health outcomes and higher survival rates than those subsisting on dense flatbreads or inadequate substitutes. The ash water method gave frontier households a tool that worked regardless of temperature, yeast availability, or resource constraints. It also represented a broader pattern of frontier innovation. Settlers faced problems that required immediate, practical solutions using available materials. Formal education was rare, scientific knowledge was limited, but practical intelligence, careful observation, and willingness to experiment produced innovations that spread through communities and improved survival odds for everyone who adopted them. Margaret Brennan died unknown beyond her immediate community. Elias Brennan lived a quiet life and left no written record of his contributions. Jonas Whitmore's letters survive in historical archives but rarely merit scholarly attention. The dozens of women who refined and spread the ash water technique remain completely anonymous, yet their collective work mattered. For 2 decades, frontier families throughout the Ohio Territory and beyond made bread using a method that emerged from personal tragedy, was refined through systematic experimentation, and spread through community cooperation. Children grew up healthier. Families survived winters that might otherwise have broken them. Small acts of innovation, shared freely, created measurable improvement in daily life. The cabins where ash water bread was baked are gone now, collapsed or burned or dismantled generations ago. The families have scattered, the technique has vanished from practice. But the principle remains relevant. Simple solutions to critical problems, discovered through necessity and shared without expectation of credit, can transform communities and save lives. That legacy, invisible and uncelebrated, deserves recognition, even when the names attached to it have faded into history.